What's up, everybody? It's Brian from the Business Reef Tank channel. I'm back again to give you another video. A couple of weeks ago I told you about my hybrid lighting system in the 180 gallon reef. This video I'm going to talk a little bit about flow in the 180 gallon. Now, if you are not a subscriber to this channel, please go ahead, hit that subscribe button below, hit the bell so you're notified whenever I release a new video, and thank you for watching the channel. So flow is just as important as lighting in a reef tank, at least in my opinion. Now, it's been said that if you take care of your water, you're really taking care of your coral reef, and I really believe that to be true. See, if you don't have good flow in your system, you can't have good water quality. If you can't have good water quality, you're not going to have a good coral reef. So it's all connected. Now, corals will do better if they have a random or turbulent flow. You want something that's going to push water all around the system. Since corals aren't moving, they have to depend on the flow in order to bring nutrients and food into their feeding tentacles. They also need that flow to get rid of the waste that feeding is going to create. So I like to have as much flow as possible in my system. Now, I do have different zones, so in different places I have to have more turbulent flow than others because I have a mixed reef. Although my reef is primarily SPS, I still have to maintain good flow for some of the other things like the fleshy LPS that I tend to have on my sand bed. So how is flow set up in my system? First off, I have a Core 20 return pump. Now this is running at 60%, and my FMM is telling me that I'm getting somewhere about 290 gallons per hour from each one of the returns. So that's pointed at the surface, so that's kind of going to give me some surface agitation, so I have a little turbulence there. As far as power heads in my system, I have 4 MP40s. Now, the ones on the sides, I run typically at about 80%. The ones in the back, I run typically at 45%. Now, I have a WXM, so I use this in order to control how my MP40s are functioning. Now, I like to have as much flow as possible, but I do have a sand bed. Unfortunately, I can't turn things all the way up on all 4 of the MP40s because that will cause a sandstorm. Now, I love wrasses, so my mixed tank here, of course, has sand in it, but you'll notice in other tanks, I really don't like to have a sand bed because I like to crank the flow up. So let's actually get into the programming that I have with this. So on these 4 MP40s, they run a custom program that I kind of created and taken from a couple of other places. You'll probably notice some of the programming in here. So between midnight and 8 a.m., I run nutrient transport mode. Now, both of these power heads are running nutrient transport mode. One is nutrient transport, the other is in async mode. Now, I do this from midnight to 8, and the reason I do this is because I want to get all of the nitrous and everything else out of the sand bed into the water column so it can be caught in the overflow and go into the sump. Now, from 8 a.m. to 12 noon, I run a reef crest constant setup. I'll have reef crest running at 80% on one side, and I'd have a constant running at 80% on the other side. You probably recognize this from the WWC Ecotech Labs white paper that came out about a year or 2 ago. Now, from noon to 4 p.m., I do the exact same thing, but I reverse it. If I was running reef crest over here, I now run reef crest over here in constant on the other side. Now, on my prime viewing time, which is between 4 p.m. and when the lights go out, but I have the schedule go until midnight, I use pulse. Now, I like pulse because I like the waves going back and forth in the system. So I do a pulse, and that's how I have this entire setup. Now, the back power heads are running a little bit different. From midnight to 8 a.m., they're running the Eco back schedule. This is the back schedule for the nutrient transport mode. It's basically just doing a constant, and then it kind of ramps up at the end of it. Now, between 8 a.m. and 12, I do once again the constant reef crest. Constant on one side, reef crest on the other side. And I do this with the back vortexes. This gives me a nice random flow. from 12 noon to 4 p.m., I basically do the same thing again, but I switch up sides. If I was doing a reef crest on the back left side, I now do reef crest on the back right side. Now from 4 p.m. to midnight, I once again do the wave, but I'm doing anti-sink on the back side. Now typically in a reef tank, you hear me say over and over again, be consistent. Don't go through and change things. Well, flow is one of those things that I believe you can make an exception for. In fact, I have this set up in my system because I like to have the ability to change whatever program that I'm doing kind of on the fly. Very similar to where if I didn't have the WXM set up, I'll be able to use the Ecotech controllers in order to change any setting that I want to. So I have this set up in my Apex, but I have it set up using virtual outlets and profiles. Now I have profiles for each one of the main EcoSmart Live settings. One for reef crest, one for tidal, one for transport mode. And what I've done, since I have these profiles set up, I have a virtual outlet set up where I can turn on and off these. I'll show you a sample of the programming so you can see exactly what I'm doing. But this gives me the ability to, if I want to see reef crest mode when it's normally a wave time, I can just go ahead and turn reef crest on and it will switch my vortex over to the reef crest mode without doing anything or changing the programming. I really like this feature, and I really use a lot of virtual outlets to do this, not only for the vortex, but I also do it for the radions as well. Overall, I really do think that I have pretty good flow. Although in the future, like I said, 2019 is going to be about change and trying to better my system, I do have a couple of ideas that I want to try out in my system. First off, I would love to take the MP40s that are on the back of the wall and put them on the sides a little bit lower than where the current MP40s are. I can then turn them down a little bit so I'm not running them so high. I could also do a lot more random patterns that way. What I'd like to put on the back wall though are a couple of gyros. I'm starting to really like the flow that the gyros are being able to produce, and I'm thinking about maybe having one in the back or maybe even two in the back, kind of creating that gyro pattern flow over and over again in the reef. I think that's going to increase my randomness of the flow and maybe increase what the corals are able to do in the system. But I'm not talking about doing that soon, but it's just one of those ideas that I had, something that just makes me go, Well, that's it for this video. Like, comment, subscribe. Let me know how the flow is going in your tank. Let me know, what do you use, what program do you have. Just let me know how you're doing with flow. As usual, YouTube, thank you for watching the channel. Take care.